From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. If you've listened to just about any past Blue Sky episodes, you know that I love history. I always have. And for this work I'm doing today, I find that some knowledge of history not only helps us understand the present better than we otherwise might, it also provides ways to keep things in perspective and understand just how good we have it today. And in this episode, I'm hosting someone who has forgotten more about history than I've ever known. His name is Martin Gutmann, and he's a professor at the Lucerne School of Business and a lecturer at ETH Zurich. Martin's research and thought leadership have reached over 60 million people through top business publications, including Forbes, where he's a regular contributor, Big Think, and Fast Company, as well as appearances on leading management podcasts. His recent TED Talk, Are We Celebrating the Wrong Leaders?, has been viewed over 1.5 million times. Martin is also the best-selling author of the very well-reviewed The Unseen Leader, How History Can Help Us Rethink Leadership. Martin was born in Sweden, and he's lived and worked in Japan, the US, Canada, Mauritius, Germany, and Switzerland. From 2016 to 2020, he was the founding managing director of the Swiss School of Public Governance. He holds a PhD in history from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, an executive MBA from IE Business School in Spain, and higher education teachers training from Harvard University and ETH Zurich. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Martin Gutmann as much as this history buff did. Martin Gutmann, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks so much, Bill. I'm so excited to be here.
As people have heard, you are currently at the Lucerne School of Business, but I want to understand your background. You also grew up in the U.S., you got a PhD in Syracuse. Could you explain sort of your winding way to the Lucerne School of Business?
Yeah, winding way is very appropriate in this regard, both geographically and also in terms of the themes or the responsibilities I've held in the last couple of years. Yeah, so I grew up in Sweden actually, and then moved to Japan. Spent a lot of time in the U.S. Then came back to Europe as a young adult. Came back to the U.S. for graduate school. And have now been in Central Europe, so in Germany or Switzerland, for the past 10, 12 years.
Amazing.
Yeah. So that's the, and this is not something I necessarily planned. It just kind of worked out that way. And I think what really got, my wife is the same. She was all over the place as well. And once we had kids, we kind of stuck to one place. It gets harder to move.
That changes your mindset.
Yeah.
And I imagine that gave you a really healthy understanding of different cultures, different parts of the world. And one of the things I've responded to in your work is your really healthy understanding of history, PhD in history. It's been said you specialize in applying historical perspectives to contemporary challenges, particularly in leadership and management. And people listening to the show know that I love history and I love studying because I think it really helps us understand today. So can you talk about how you've applied history in your work, and then let's apply it to leadership and optimism if we could?
Let's give it a try.
Yes.
No, so I think the first question is, what does that mean to apply history or historical insights to contemporary challenges and questions that we have? I think the first thing I have to say on that is that I don't think history has the answers to the questions we're asking today, right? But they can give us a part of the answer, or they're a component in our journey of discovering the directions we might want to take in the future. And I think a good way to think about this is that if you go to the doctor and you say, oh, my knee hurts, there are all kinds of diagnostics they can run, from an MRI to X-rays or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
I'm PhD in history, not medicine, so
Yes,
that's as far
I
as
get
my
it.
knowledge goes, right? But a good doctor is also obviously going to ask you, when did this pain start, right? Is it worse in the morning or in the evening?
Right,
What happens when you exercise? So this history, is kind of a prerequisite for understanding where we are today and what this might imply for the future. So that's kind of my pitch, that regardless of what you might be interested in understanding and combating poverty or sustainable development or women's rights, anything, right? You kind of need to be fluent in the history of that topic, and not just the superficial stuff we learn in high school, but really kind of the details, because a lot of things have already been tried. And there are a lot of things that I think are integral to a problem today that almost become invisible to us today, unless we go back and notice that, okay, this developed that way because somebody made this decision. It's not God-given or kind of a natural state of things. So that's my pitch for integrating history into everything that we discuss.
I love the medical analogy. That makes total sense. And I think a history too. Kevin Kelly was on my show, and he said something to the effect of that a lot of today's problems were caused by yesterday's solutions. And our job today is to come up to today's solutions, right? So for example, industrialization pulled people out of poverty, raised standards of living, et cetera, burned a lot of fossil fuels, and now we have climate change. So part of our challenge is I think to understand that and then say, okay, so those are today's problems based on yesterday's solutions. How are we going to solve those and keep progressing? Does that concept make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think what just came to mind as you said this is, I was just rereading a book that I'd worked on a couple of years ago with a bunch of different historians on the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the UN's plan for achieving sustainability by 2030. And one of the figures that we cite in this book is that world energy use shot up from 250 millions of metric tons of oil equivalent to 10,000 between 1800 and 2000.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Staggering.
Right? So it's really, the Industrial Revolution was an energy revolution. We're consuming so much more energy. Now, in that figure, I think is both a lot of the progress, right? A lot of the increase in certainly in GDP, but also in human well-being, but also a lot of the destruction and the changes that we're only just starting to grapple with. And maybe this is a transition to your point about optimism and pessimism. I think in that one number, you can see it as incredibly optimistic, but also as incredibly pessimistic.
Right. And the ability to make a change like that, you could argue, the fact that we did that maybe emboldens us to think, well, maybe we can do it in reverse just as effectively with these technologies we have now in front of us. And one thing to be optimistic about when it comes to climate change is, in a pretty short period of time, at least in the United States, I don't know what it's been like around the world, but getting people to actually admit that it's a problem and that humans have had a hand in it, that's a fairly recent phenomenon for a big chunk of people.
Yeah. I totally agree. And, I just think about the way my kids, so I have one teenager and two kids are a bit younger, the way they not only talk about sustainability and climate change, but the way it impacts decisions that they make in everyday life is incredible to me, because, one generation ago when I was their age, that was totally not on my radar at all.
Not even close.
And so I think we tend to think of humans as being very stubborn and a lot of our behaviors and beliefs being very deeply ingrained. And there are a lot of examples, I think, that suggest that that's true. But we also have the capacity to change very quickly.
And I'm glad you mentioned that about your kids, because one of the things I encourage people to do especially when they get down on the future, is spend time with younger people because they have that idealism and it's genuine. And I interviewed a man named Charles Kenny, and he has written a book about progress. And he said that generation, maybe a little bit older than your kids, but around that age, could be the greatest generation in the history of the planet. And I hear that, I'm like, oh, wait a second, pump the brakes. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they're going to be the largest in number. They're going to be the most tech savvy. They're going to be the most socially tolerant. And basically, if we can just stay out of their way or at least help keep them optimistic by our own behavior and actions, then they're going to solve all these problems that we've left for them. Does that ring true to you? Because you also teach young people.
I do. I think the odds are good that this generation can do that. And what I will say, I really appreciate about what you just said is that you put the emphasis on these young people, on the people, because I think let's say a false interpretation of history that I often hear is that, technologies kind of save us or improve our lives or solve problems for us. And, really it comes down to how we use technologies, not the technologies themselves. And an example I really like or I can bring two examples here to bear. One is that at the turn of the last century, when the vacuum cleaner was invented, everybody's saying, wow, this is liberating, because now suddenly the work in the homes that women were expected to do in the US and in kind of Western Europe is going to be reduced by, fivefold, because it's no longer going to take hours and hours to sweep the floor. You just vacuum and you're done. What ended up happening? Well, the expectations of cleanliness simply rose. Yes. So now instead of cleaning once a week, you had to do it every day. When atomic energy, was developed and then really integrated into the U.S. in the 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commissioner Lewis Strauss, he famously said, "Electricity is going to be so cheap we won't even have to meter it." And in the 60s, the U.S. Senate said, "This thing is so amazing. By the year 2000, U.S. workers are only going to have to work 14 hours per week." Of course, that didn't
quite happen.
Right? So, the expectations of what output should be of the work that we should do simply rose as these new technologies were introduced. So there's often this false promise of time-saving devices that we keep falling for that trap. I think AI is similar, if I can be honest.
Yes, that's an excellent point. In addition to loving history, I'm also a sucker for a good analogy. And I really like the one Martin offered about the knee injury and how, just like understanding a medical history can inform a diagnosis and treatment plan, studying world history can help us get a sense for how we wound up where we are and what possible steps forward might look like. And I agree completely with Professor Gutmann that individual technologies are generally not good or bad in and of themselves. It's how humans use them that matters. Now, back to our conversation. So you mentioned focusing on people, and history, we tend to focus on, understandably, on the famous people, the leaders, if you will. I interviewed Bert Jacobs, who founded the Life is Good company that makes the t-shirts.
Yeah.
It's all about optimism. And he has a great line that I use a lot, which is, I challenge people to bring me the list of history's great pessimists. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the people you've studied throughout history who have emerged as leaders. And among their qualities, would you put some sort of sense of optimism, genuine optimism, and also have an ability to project that hope and optimism on the people they hope would follow them?
I think without a doubt. I mean, one of the indispensable qualities of good leaders is the ability to envision something that the average person does not yet see. Right? And I think that's also true in the smaller realms. It's easy to talk about presidents and these kind of grand politicians, but just thinking, in a small company, right? often take somebody and say, look, it feels like we're stuck in this rut. I know, but listen to me. There is another option. It looks like this. Here's what we can do to get there. Right? That's really one of the qualities that good leaders have. Right? The ability to envision an alternative that's not evident to everybody else. Now, with that said, I think the same is, of course, true for history's very impactful bad, or let's say evil leaders. They had that same ability.
Sure.
Just their visions were not very rosy ones, but they were able to motivate people to work very hard towards those as well. So it's a component of leadership, let's say on the good side and on the bad side. Absolutely.
And are there favorites of yours as you study history? I know some that, and we'll talk a little bit about your book, Unseen Leadership, about some of the people who have been revered, who you say, well, maybe we're placing that in the wrong spot. Do you have favorites throughout history as you study it, who you would hold up maybe to your kids or to our listeners as people
there's
read about?
How much time do you have?
Where do you start?
Yeah. No, I that's a tough one. It's tough to know where to start. I do tend to gravitate towards the ones who are less famous, less prominent in the traditional retellings of history. Simply because, there's great books on Churchill. There's great books on Napoleon. They're very interesting. I've also written about Churchill. But in the end, I find these, let's say, more forgotten characters much more interesting.
Yeah.
And I think a part of that is that we have this false assumption sometimes that if somebody had a very prominent position of leadership, they must also have had a lot of impact. And I don't know that that's always true. So a great example, and this is actually one that my colleague Gautam Mukunda often tells, is Thomas Jefferson, who is widely regarded as one of the most influential or impactful U.S. presidents.
Right.
Why? Now, we're not talking about his role in let's say designing the new government. That was, of course, he was a central figure, central founding father as well. But as a president, why is he ranked so highly? Well, it's because of the Louisiana Purchase. Yeah,
right.
So he managed through peaceful means to, essentially double the size of the country for $15 million. Which turns out, I looked at the calculations, about $18 per square mile.
Good Lord. Yeah.
So
good deal.
Great deal, right? This guy had such a huge impact. But now let's look at the actual details of that purchase. So Jefferson actually sends an emissary to France, and he instructs the emissary, I would like you to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans, only the city. And you can pay up to $10 million for that.
Oh my God.
Before his emissary arrives in Paris, Napoleon tells his guy, go to the American ambassador and tell him we'd like to sell them all of Louisiana for the price of $15 million. Of course, the ambassador says yes. Jefferson's emissary arrives. He also says, yes, that's a fantastic deal. They take it back to Washington. Everyone is jubilant about this. The only person who kind of puts the brakes on is Thomas Jefferson. Because he says, okay, this is a good deal, but can the federal government really do this? We'd have to first, change the Constitution to allow that to happen. And essentially people, kind of give him a reality check and say, look, Napoleon insists that this has got to happen right away. Yeah. Just sign the deal because this is the deal.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. This is the deal of the century. So is it kind of fair, let's say, to credit Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase? Sure, it happened on his watch and he, in the end, signed off on it, but it wasn't his idea and he kind of put the brakes on it. So this is kind of a very winding way of making the point that I think if we're trying to measure kind of impact and influence, we have to look beyond the position and kind of the resume, if you will, the things that happen on somebody's watch. And we have to ask ourselves, what did they contribute to it? So that's a little bit of how I like to see that in history.
I think it's really helpful too, because we tend to, I think people get discouraged because they're not they're not on the front page of Fortune magazine. They haven't reached these levels. They haven't, what kind of contribution are they making? And it is those unseen people who frankly get things done. And if you ask a really honest CEO, they'll tell you, they're like, I don't actually do much. I'm not the one making the widgets. I'm not the one producing the movies. I'm not the one. It's everybody else. I paint a picture. I create a vision, but I don't do much.
Yeah.
Does that ring true to you throughout history as well?
Certainly. I think in a lot of, I mean, let's back up. I think it depends a bit on the circumstances, right? So in a crisis, I think what very often is required is somebody to kind of take charge and make decisions without consulting everybody, right? Without kind of having long discussions.
No time. Yeah.
But in, let's say, more stable periods, whether it's a company or a country, I think the most effective leaders find ways to kind of establish healthy norms and structures and procedures that allow all of these very capable individuals to work together, and also to kind of to innovate and to keep things moving in the right direction. So to set a vision, kind of lay the foundations for that, and then take a step back. I think that's essentially what we're finding today in a lot of the most successful companies as well, that really effective leaders can do that. They strike that balance. You can't really micromanage your way through this. And sometimes I think leadership is about making the decision that nobody else is willing to make. And a good example here, and you asked about kind of unseen leaders or kind of forgotten leaders that I like to discuss or write about. So one I've been reading a lot about recently is Vasily Archipov. Does that ring a bell?
No, it doesn't.
I imagine it wouldn't. Most people never heard of him. So we'll go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? In the early 1960s, under Kennedy's watch, and during these famous 13 days where there's a standoff, right, between Washington and Moscow, and the U.S. Navy is essentially trying to cut off Cuba from receiving deliveries from the Soviet Union. There's this one little episode that plays out where 11 U.S. destroyers and an aircraft carrier have a Soviet submarine surrounded, and they want it to surface. And so what they do is they start dropping depth charges, not to sink it, but to get it to surface so they can instruct it to leave these waters and head back to the Soviet Union. Now, Washington informs Moscow that we've got this submarine of yours. It was designated B-59. We've got it surrounded, and we're just trying to get it to surface, right? What Washington did not know was that this submarine was out of touch with Moscow. So they were not aware. They were simply underwater being bombarded. Wow. And what Washington also did not know was that on board this submarine was a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo, which the crew had authorization to fire without any confirmation or instructions from Moscow if they felt that that was the required action to take. Wow. There were 3 officers on board, and all 3 of them had to be in agreement to fire it, for that decision to be taken. And 2 of them, as they were underwater, hearing these depth charges go off all around them, said, this is it. The nuclear war has started. We have no choice but to fire this nuclear torpedo at the USS Randolph, this aircraft carrier that was part of this U.S. fleet that was surrounding it. And the 3rd officer, Vasily Archipov, said, no.
Wow.
I'm not going to do that. I think they're trying to get us to surface. It's not worth the risk of starting a nuclear war over this. And they surfaced, and in fact, there was no nuclear war taking place.
Wow.
And they steamed back to the Soviet Union with their submarine. So this one man, really changed the course of history, because that could have been it, right?
Oh, yeah. And instead you read about JFK and Khrushchev.
Yeah, no,
Part of your point, right?
Of course,
and understandably, but
absolutely. And I'm actually a pretty big fan of how Kennedy handled that as well, but that's on a different level.
Right.
And I think that the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis can't be told or fully understood just by looking at the bigwigs in Washington and Moscow.
It's a great story, and one of the reasons I like history too is it just reminds you of how precarious things have been in the past that we've survived. I don't think I'm a little biased. I don't think we're as history literate as we should be in the country where I am speaking from, and a lot of people have no idea about the Cuban Missile Crisis and just how close we came, and we still are under the cloud of a potential nuclear war, but never have we been as close as we were then. And I don't think I'd ever heard that story. You can probably hear how much I was enjoying this conversation and the different ways that Martin Gutmann challenges us to look at history. Thomas Jefferson's role in the Louisiana Purchase, for example, was far different than we remember learning in class. And likewise, while the actions of Kennedy and Khrushchev are most often studied when learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the clear-headedness of a Soviet submarine officer we've never heard of that likely saved the world from a catastrophic nuclear war. Next, we'll talk about another world leader we've all heard of. I would like to circle back to Winston Churchill, because why not? And he's quoted all the time. But I think about him, obviously his career was fascinating because he wasn't sort of destined for this. He was rejected and his career was over many times. And then all of a sudden he's thrust into World War II. And one of the things you write about, or the concept you talk about too in your TED Talk, is this idea that we often revere the people who manage a crisis as opposed to the ones who avoid the crisis in the first place. I would argue, Churchill had this crisis sort of thrust upon him. And I was struck because I read Erik Larson's The Splendid and the Vile as the COVID pandemic was coming on here and if you haven't read it, it's about the Battle of Britain. And that's something that especially Americans, I think, really have trouble relating to just how grim that was. So here we were, and COVID was terrible and scary and everything else, but it wasn't the Battle of Britain. And I'm reading about this guy who almost every day it seemed like was on the radio, was standing on the rubble, was inspiring his people. Can you talk about Churchill and how you think about him through these different lenses as the crisis manager versus crisis creator, and obviously a very seen leader versus unseen? I just find him to be a fascinating figure, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Churchill, it's kind of difficult to talk about or understand the 20th century without looking at Churchill. If we think about South Africa and the legacy of apartheid there, he was there during the Boer War on the side of the British, not the Afrikaans speaking people, but nonetheless, he was there. He was part of that. India, of course, he played a huge role there. Was a big proponent of colonialism, of imperialism. So he's not necessarily, a singularly good force in history at all. Large part of his life was spent making a lot of other people's lives miserable. But in the Second World War, you're right, this was his moment. And, he's kind of recalled back into politics after everybody had assumed his career was over. And I think you're right that, of course, this was not a crisis of his making. In fact, he was one of the few British politicians who recognized Hitler's true motives and Hitler's true ambitions very early on, right? Which a lot of the other politicians did not or did not admit. Right? There's this whole appeasement movement of trying to find a way to accommodate, to understand Hitler's needs and accommodate them through peaceful means. You can't do that if somebody believes that war and violence is necessary for the regeneration of a nation and that there are people who need to be exterminated for your nation to survive. you can't really negotiate with somebody like that, right? So, and he
Yeah.
understood that. And so that's a little bit, maybe not the vision part, but kind of being able to understand a situation despite the fact that everybody else sees it differently. That was an ability that he had. Right. So he takes office in the summer of 1940. Shortly thereafter, France falls, and I take a little bit of issue with the overemphasis on the Battle of Britain and the survival of Britain, because even the German generals at the time, who are not really known for lacking in confidence, were very clear that Operation Sea Lion, which was the code name for the planned invasion of the British Isles, had no chance of succeeding. Not going to happen. Yeah, they knew that. Hitler very quickly realized that as well. So the Battle of Britain, this is an attempt, and nearly successful attempt, at isolating the British Isles, at weakening them so that they would negotiate some kind of peace, which would allow Hitler to focus on the Eurasian landmass and kind of leave the British to have their empire elsewhere and do their own thing. Right. So I think the remarkable thing with Churchill is not that he helped his nation survive. The survival was guaranteed. Like, the Germans were not going to successfully raid the British Isles. The remarkable thing with Churchill is that he says, no, we, and at this point, it's not the US and the Soviet Union, it's we, the British and the British Empire, we're going to fight Nazism and we're going to destroy it. That commitment, he knew, would cost a lot of British lives and would be very, very challenging. Especially after they lose most of their war material on the beaches of Dunkirk. They did lose a lot of airplanes in the Battle of Britain. So they're kind of starting from a very weak point. And to make this decision to say, it's not about our survival, we're going to prosecute this war until Nazism is defeated, I think that's the remarkable thing about Churchill. And now, how does he make that happen? Well, part of it is creating this kind of myth of a nation on the brink of destruction, right? And why is that myth so powerful? Well, first of all, it motivates your own people. And secondly, it can help motivate the ally he knows he needs. He talks about this in the summer of 1940. His son, actually, one morning, he's shaving, and his son asks him, Randolph, how are you going to win the war? He says, easy, I'm going to drag the US into it. And that's what he does. He launches what we would today call an advocacy campaign, this deliberate, strategic, long-term plan of getting the U.S. into the war, and that's what he does. And think about it this way, kind of, this is an interesting perspective. In hindsight, we don't really question the fact that the U.S., emphasized fighting Hitler first, and Mussolini prosecuting the war in Europe first, and only later kind of throwing their full weight into the Pacific. But it's kind of odd if you think about it, because Pearl Harbor was launched by the Japanese, right? In an alternative, let's say, world, perhaps the U.S. would only have focused on the Pacific. But it's really Churchill who has already kind of done everything short of having full commitment from the U.S. before Pearl Harbor that assures that the European theater is the primary theater and remains that way until Hitler and Mussolini a few years before that are defeated.
No, that last one's a huge point, because there were people in America saying, what did the Germans ever do to us? We just got bombed by the Japanese, people like Lindbergh and others who were frankly siding with the Germans in some ways. There was a pretty powerful faction here that was resisting our involvement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Once again, Martin does a thoughtful and effective job here at looking at several different sides of Winston Churchill and his true impact on the world. I'll always maintain that Churchill's steadfast optimism and his remarkable ability to communicate a vision of hope and perseverance played a big role in helping the Allies win the war. And yet, Martin points out that some of his achievements are likely overstated, just as I've learned that many quotations attributed to Churchill are ones he never actually said. We'll now dive more deeply into Martin's most recent research and writing on the concept of the unseen leader, the title of his recent book. Let's talk a little bit about the unseen leader. I'm fascinated by this concept. I loved your TED Talk, and I encourage people to watch it. And the example, or an example that you've used, and you've written an op-ed about it that appeared in my local paper in Maine, about Shackleton. And first question is Shackleton, he's a phenomenon here in the US. I assume it's the same way in other parts of the world. If you'd let us know that. And then tell me why he's such a good example of what you're talking about. And brace yourselves, folks, because you're going to hear the first ever somewhat tap the brakes on how great Shackleton was in just a second.
So
I love it, though. It's great.
I need to tread carefully here, because actually the piece you're referencing this is a paper in Maine, right?
Yes, but it was on the AP, I think, or somewhere. It got picked up.
I wrote it for the Chicago Tribune, and I actually got my first full-on legitimate hate mail as a result of that piece.
I love it.
So
I love it.
Now I might have gotten
Tell
more.
us about it.
I don't. I also, I'm quite hard on Shackleton in my TED Talk and my book as well, and I'm sure people have commented on it on the YouTube channel, but I don't read those comments.
You're too smart to read them.
So anyway, who is Shackleton in case you don't know? So Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish explorer at the turn of the last century. So, pre-World War I era and during the First World War. And he was one of a series of British explorers who, some of them independently, but many of them within the realm of the Royal Navy or the Royal Geographic Society, were intent on conquering the four goals of polar exploration: the North and the South Pole, and the Northwest Passage above the northern tip of Canada, and the Northeast Passage above the northern tip of Russia. And Shackleton set off for the South Pole 4 times in his career. Every time he failed, and many times it was catastrophic, including loss of life, etc. Now, he is revered. Why? Well, on his expedition that set off in 1914, the so-called Endurance Expedition, his ship becomes trapped in the ice before reaching Antarctica. It's subsequently crushed by the ice, and he and his men have to kind of trek across ice floes, use little wooden rowing boats until they finally, it's an epic adventure, until they finally get back to safety in 1916. So here's what I have to say about that. If you are looking for a story for a Hollywood movie, or you want to write a bestseller, Shackleton is your guy. This story is amazing.
Crazy, yeah.
And in fact, one of the reasons he's so popular, he was very popular at the time, but in 1959, this book is published by Alfred Lansing called Endurance, and becomes a bestseller. And since then, the same book's kind of been rewritten multiple times, Harvard Business School has a bunch of case studies on Shackleton, etc. So why am I hard on this guy? Well, because if we look more carefully, we find that this drama, or these crises moments that he encountered on every one of his expeditions, were often due to very poor decisions that he made in terms of the equipment he brought, in terms of how he trained his men. In 1914, on his way to Antarctica, the local whalers in South Georgia tell him, "You got to wait. The ice is particularly thick this year." He doesn't heed their advice. He has a second ship on that expedition, the Aurora, which is supposed to meet them on the other side. It was supposed to be a trans-Antarctic expedition. He gives them very careful instructions. He picks the crew. He equips them. It's a disaster, and 3 men end up dying in the end. Right. Now, that part's often left out when people revere Shackleton. Right. So I say great story, but a leader is probably not the guy we want to learn from or revere. So who is I think it's clear in my mind, it's the Norwegian Roald Amundsen. Amundsen is less well known. Harvard Business School doesn't have any case studies on him, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Very few bestsellers on him.
Yeah.
Very few books at all. However, I mentioned the 4 goals of polar exploration. In his lifetime, Roald Amundsen achieved all 4 of them. 3 of them, he was the first, or part of the first expedition to achieve it.
Right.
And, this guy is the ultimate polar explorer. And I think if we look more broadly, the ultimate leader, right? He had both this ability to meticulously plan, to understand what are the real dangers and, the real drivers of this environment that I'm going into. How can I adopt an expedition for that? He was very pragmatic. He took some very new and risky technologies with him. And in other cases, he went with Inuit clothing, for example, and ways of preserving food, because why invent something new when there's a kind of an older technology that works much better than anything that the Europeans or Americans come up with. Also, in the field, he has a very authentic kind of, he has this leadership ability of being both friendly and open and warm. Like all his men speak very warmly of him, that he always included them, made them feel good about what they were doing. But he made the decisions and he could live with them. He stood by them when necessary. Right. So he was just a great planner, a great leader in the field, and his expeditions unfolded without any drama. Right. So I wouldn't make a Hollywood movie about Roald Amundsen, and you can't write a best-selling book about him. That's Shackleton. But if we're looking for leadership lessons, you got to go to Amundsen.
And Martin, I'm really glad you walked through that and people might be wondering, why is Bill asking him to talk about this? I'll tell you why. Because I think one of the challenges we have as a society is that we are fed news about people who, quote unquote, make news. And what makes news? A crisis, a scandal, outrageous behavior, increasingly outrage, who's got the hotter take, who's yelling louder, who did the crazy controversial thing. And the vast majority of people are not those people. I believe the vast majority of business leaders are ethical and good people. I think the vast majority of human beings are good people. But we are so finely tuned to exceptions and change and negativity that it clouds our judgment. And so I think for me, it's wonderful to hear about someone like Amundsen who did all these great things. And guess what? He didn't make news because he didn't create a crisis, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Does that describe it fairly?
Completely, yes. And to be fair, people had heard of him during the time. It was front page news that he took an airship across the North Pole and he crossed the Northwest Passage in a small boat. This was big news, but now a century later, he's not the kind of household name the way Shackleton is. And I think you're spot on that if you make noise and if you kind of find yourself in dramatic circumstances, even if you contributed an awful lot to getting yourself into those dramatic circumstances, you're going to be remembered and revered. And I think the same is true in kind of a lot of organizations today, right? The project manager who finishes a project ahead of schedule, under budget. We appreciate that guy or that woman, right? But what about the guy who had this massive last-minute disaster and then managed to work his way through it, and it was such a struggle, and here's how he did it. That's the guy where we're like, wow, he's a real leader. Let's promote him.
Yeah, and if you ask people to reflect on people they work with that they admire, and particularly leaders, often, I think the research supports one of the top characteristics is usually humility. But when was the last time you read a headline about a humble politician or frankly, even a humble, Fortune 500 executive? We celebrate the lack of humility, whereas in terms of media, then we consume that versus in our day-to-day, we don't celebrate that. And I think it's an important thing for us to understand and try to work on.
Agreed. Completely. And I think it's a bit easier in organizations to focus, companies to focus a bit more on people with humility. I think in politics, the real crux is that what it takes to get elected is an entirely different skill set from what it takes to govern. Right? And humility is not going to get you elected.
No.
Nor is competency and policy or anything else, right? That's not what it takes. To get elected, you got to make a lot of noise and tell a great story.
Okay, first off, I will admit that I'm one of those Shackleton admirers that Martin refers to. Endurance was a great book and an amazing story. But again, here Martin challenges the hero worship that's been attached to a guy who ignored warnings and put him and his crew in the very danger that he's credited with pulling them out of. And on the other side of the ledger, the quiet leadership of the less well-known Roald Amundsen is also less well celebrated, but arguably far more admirable. And in a democracy, we'd all do well to remember what Martin says about politicians, that one set of skills is helpful in getting elected, while an entirely different one is useful while in office. To quote George Washington, in another great work of history, the musical Hamilton, "Winning was easy, young man, governing's harder." And now to my final segment with Martin Gutmann. One of the things I think happens to human nature, we think everything's just happening to us. You have this, as we started the conversation, you have this broad historical view, but also this broad international view. Can you help us understand how different, if at all, does it feel where you're sitting in that part of the world versus what we're feeling here as the second Trump administration comes in? How are people feeling about politics and the types of people who are in leadership, and how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I am an American citizen. I follow events in the U.S. very closely. My parents are there, a lot of my friends. So I feel, more involved and affected by what goes on in the U.S. than your average European, I would guess.
Sure.
But leaving that aside for the moment, so I work in Switzerland, but I live in southern Germany, which is one of the wonderful things about Europe is that that's very possible, and it's not particularly complicated. Right? I just take the train across the border to go to work.
It's like I live here, but I could be in Washington D.C. and it's no big deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I would say, a year ago, as the election was underway, or the campaign was underway in the U.S., people certainly watched it with concern and interest, but it didn't feel as relevant, let's say. Obviously everybody knows in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the war in Ukraine that's going on nearby.
Sure.
If Trump were elected at that point, that wasn't clear, that would have an impact, right? Versus Kamala Harris. But now I think it has become much more pressing, also because there's going to be elections in Germany next month. The government has essentially collapsed, and the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, kind of essentially the reconstituted Nazi party, is polling very high, and their candidate, or their lead candidate, is getting a lot of airtime, including within a live interview with Elon Musk. So it feels like the developments in the U.S. are now directly impacting developments here. So long story short, I think people are concerned.
Yep.
But there's also a lot of resilience in the institutions here, as there is in the U.S. as well. And also a lot of good people in politics and elsewhere. So, hopefully this will be a blip in Europe's history, let's say, that it will, remain strong in its democratic institutions and traditions.
So with the few minutes we have left, let's end on an optimistic note, I hope, with the answer to this question. Like I said before, you spend a lot of time around younger people, not just your kids, but younger than me, certainly, the students that you teach. And I'd love to hear, as you interact with these people, what gives you hope and optimism as you see them sort of charting their lives, taking your classes, thinking about the future. Can you paint us an optimistic picture based on the time you spend around younger people?
I think that question is in some ways too easy, right? If you
Good.
At least in my experience, when I work with students in the classroom or in other activities, or when I'm at home with my kids, they have this unyielding optimism, and it's contagious, and it's why it's great to spend time with them. And what I especially appreciate is, kids haven't lost. They're not as jaded as we are, right? So if my wife and I might talk about, hey, we should, why don't we do this for our vacation? The first thing that I start thinking about is, well, that's not going to work because of this, and that's going to be tricky with that, et cetera. And kids don't think that way, right? It's like, let me just live in the reality for a moment of going on vacation there, or whatever the case might be. And they just have this ability to dream and envision things, and whatever the constraints might be, that's a secondary thought, if at all. So my daughter, for example, who's our youngest, loves to read these books about famous and some unfamous characters of history, people who achieved great things in music and in arts, in politics, across the world. And it really inspires her. So one day she's like, I want to be a famous pianist. And the next day, I want to be a space explorer, an astronaut. And the next day, this or that. And I think that's fantastic. I thought it was fantastic until she came home with another book in this series. And guess who it was on? She had brought home Mandela already, and all these amazing people. Ernest Shackleton.
No. I love it. I wonder if the librarian or teacher was tweaking you and said, hey, bring this home to the old man.
Maybe. That's very possible. Yeah.
I love that. Well, this has been a real pleasure, Martin. On that note, we'll wrap things up. I really thank you for your work and the time you spent with us. And I encourage people to check out your TED Talk and read Unseen Leader and your other work. And it's just a pleasure to talk to someone who shares my interest in history and has so much more knowledge about it than I do. So thank you so much, Martin, for your time.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
Take care.
You too.
It was music to my ears when, in answer to my question about whether being around young people makes him optimistic, Martin said, that question is almost too easy. It really does help to remind ourselves that young people today can still approach life with hope and optimism, and it's incumbent on those of us in the audience who are on the older side, including yours truly, to be sure that we don't take that away from them. And I love Martin's story about the book his daughter brought home, and I can see a mischievous school teacher suggesting to her that she read up on Shackleton just to tweak her old man. I hope you enjoyed this walk down history lane with Martin Gutmann. Before you go, it would be great if you'd leave us a rating or review, and consider subscribing to the Blue Sky podcast and following the Optimism Institute on social media to be sure you never miss a future episode. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the remarkable team at Sound On, Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. And all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. And that's Crush with a K, if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.